My name is Sarah, and this is not a story you were meant to hear. It was meant to be buried under the weight of tobacco leaves, silenced by the crack of the overseer's whip, and forgotten in the unmarked graves of a Maryland plantation. But a story, like a seed, can lie dormant for 100 years and still find its way to the sun. They tell you a child born into bondage knows no other life, that the chains feel as natural as your own skin. They lie. I remember the exact moment the world broke in two. I was 6 years old, small enough to hide in the tall grass by the curing barn. The air was thick with the sweet, sickening smell of drying tobacco, a smell that still clings to my memories. From my hiding spot, I watched the master, Mr. Covington, sell a boy named Thomas. Thomas wasn't much older than me. His mother, Leah, was holding his hand, her knuckles white. I saw the gold coins pass from the trader's hand to Covington's, and then I saw them rip Thomas from his mother's arms. The sound she made, it wasn't a scream, it was the sound of a soul being torn from a body. In that moment, I didn't just see injustice, I felt it. It was a cold, sharp thing that lodged itself right under my ribs, and it has been there ever since. That was the day I learned what a person was worth in their world. A handful of coins. My world was the Covington plantation, a sprawling tract of land on the eastern shore of Maryland. Our lives were measured by the sun's journey across the sky. Sunrise meant the fields. Sunset meant a brief, exhausted respite in the quarters. My mother, Ruth, was the plantation's healer. She had hands that could soothe a fever and a memory that held generations. She knew every root, every leaf, every flower that grew in the woods bordering the fields. Some plants heal the body, Sarah, she would whisper to me as we gathered herbs in secret, and some can free the spirit. She never explained what she meant, but I held on to her words. My father, Jacob, was a giant of a man with hands calloused from decades of labor. He spoke little, but his resistance was a quiet, stubborn fire. He worked the fields with a deliberate slowness that drove the overseer mad, a pace just shy of earning a lashing. He would break a tool, accidentally, of course, just when the workload was heaviest, buying us all a precious hour of rest. He taught me to read the stars, not for navigation, but for hope. "See that gourd, child," he'd point to the Big Dipper. "It always points to the North Star. No matter how dark the night, that star don't move. Remember that." Our cabin was small, the walls thin enough to hear the wind whisper through. But inside we kept a world of our own. It was a world built of my mother's stories, whispered in the dark, tales of African kings and cunning spiders named Anansi. It was a world woven from the songs we sang in the fields, songs that sounded like sorrow to the master, but were roadmaps and warnings to us. "Wade in the water," we'd sing, a reminder to use the streams to throw the hounds off our scent. It was a true story of resistance and sung in plain sight. My mother had a secret. Under a loose floorboard in our cabin, she kept a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside were her treasures. A few smooth stones, a brass button that had fallen from a guest's coat, and 2 or 3 actual coins, earned from selling foraged herbs to a sympathetic cook in the big house. These were her hidden coins, a collection of impossible hope. "One day," she'd murmur, her voice barely audible, "we'll have enough. We'll buy our time. Mother buys her own freedom, and the freedom of her child." It was a dream that felt as distant as the moon, a fantasy to get through the night. But to her, it was real. Every coin, every button, was a prayer for a life she could barely imagine. I would watch her count them, her fingers tracing the metal as if it held the magic of liberation. I didn't understand then that she wasn't just saving coins, she was saving a piece of her soul. A piece of a future she was determined to give me, even if she never saw it herself. That was the legacy she was building for me, one impossible coin at a time. The weight of that hope, that dream, was heavier than any chain. The desire for knowledge, once sparked, is a fire that cannot be easily extinguished. For me, that spark came from the Master's own Bible. Mrs. Covington, a woman who drowned her own misery in laudanum and piety, would sometimes read scripture to the house servants. She'd read about Moses leading his people out of bondage, and I'd listen, my heart hammering in my chest. The words were a mystery, a code I couldn't crack. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that the power was in the reading itself. My education began in a whisper. The Master's nephew, a pale, sickly boy named Arthur, was sent to the plantation one summer to recover his health. He was lonely and found a strange kinship with me. While I fanned him on the veranda, he'd complain about his Latin lessons. I asked him what the strange marks in his book meant. Curious and perhaps a little bored, he began to teach me. An A for Arthur, a B for Bible. We started with his name, then mine, S-A-R-A-H. Seeing my own name written down was like seeing my own soul for the first time. It was real. It existed outside of Master Covington's ledger. It was mine. Every stolen moment became a lesson. I'd trace letters in the dirt with a stick. I'd study the discarded newspapers used to wrap fish from the market. Words began to emerge from the meaningless squiggles. Runaway, reward, north. Each new word was a key unlocking another door in my prison. I learned, as Frederick Douglass had, that literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was a dangerous knowledge. To be caught reading was to be promised a whipping, or worse. But the risk was its own reward. This new world of words led me to a new understanding of the whispers I'd heard my whole life. The Underground Railroad. It wasn't a real railroad with iron tracks and steam engines. It was a secret, shifting path to the north, a network of brave souls, black and white, who defied the law to help people like me. The songs we sang in the fields took on a new, electrifying meaning. Follow the Drinking Gourd was no longer just a tune. It was a direct command from my father, a map etched into music. The North Star was my compass. The river was my shield. My resistance, once just a feeling of injustice under my ribs, began to take form. It started small. I used the knowledge my mother, Ruth, had given me. A field hand was worked to the point of collapse. I'd find him later and give him a poultice of comfrey root to ease the pain and a tea of willow bark to fight the fever. An overseer was particularly cruel. I learned which berries, if brewed into a tea, would cause a terrible but temporary stomach ailment, buying the field hands a day of reprieve. They were small victories, invisible acts of war. This became my own true story of resistance. I began to build alliances. There was Samuel, a blacksmith whose quiet strength mirrored my father's. We spoke not in words, but in shared glances over the fire in his smithy. He would accidentally leave a broken file or a piece of scrap metal where I could find it, tools I might one day need. There was old Ilara, a woman who had been on the plantation since it was first carved out of the wilderness. She couldn't read words, but she could read people. She saw the fire in me and became my confidant. She told me which patrollers were lazy, which routes they took, which of our own people were too broken by fear to be trusted. My special skill, the one that would become my weapon, was my memory, honed by years of memorizing my mother's herbal remedies and my father's celestial maps. Now, I turned it to a new purpose. Every time I was sent to the nearby town for supplies, I didn't just see a road, I saw a map. I memorized every turn, every creek, every dense patch of woods, every barn that looked like it could offer a hiding place. I catalogued the patterns of the moon and the schedules of the patrols. In my mind, I was building an invisible library of escape. My mother's dream of how a mother buys her own freedom was no longer about money. The dream evolved. She had collected hidden coins of gold and brass. I was collecting hidden details, roots and knowledge. This was how I would purchase my liberty, not with coin, but with courage and cunning. The dream of freedom is one thing. The architecture of it is another. For 2 years, my life became a study in duality. By day, I was Sarah, the quiet, obedient servant, skilled with herbs and remedies. By night, in the slivers of time between exhaustion and sleep, I was an architect, a cartographer, a general planning a war with an army of one. My maps were my most treasured and dangerous possessions. I had no paper, no ink, so I used what I had. On the back of a piece of supple deerskin Samuel had procured for me, I began to draw. Using a piece of charcoal, I sketched the layout of the Covington plantation and the lands surrounding it. I used berry juice for rivers and clay for roads. This was more than a map. It was a testament. Every landmark was a memory. The split oak where I'd seen a patroller's horse go lame, the shallow part of the Choptank River safe to cross on foot, the thicket of thorns so dense not even a dog could push through. I was mapping my way out of hell, one charcoal line at a time. Identifying allies was a dance of immense risk. Trust was a currency more valuable than gold. I started with the most obvious and dangerous link, the Quakers. I knew from whispers that a Quaker farmer named Thomas Garrett, who lived across the state line in Delaware, was a station master on the railroad. But how to reach him? The link came from an unexpected place. A free black man named Joseph, who drove a wagon delivering goods to the plantations in our area, sometimes spoke with my father. I watched him for months. I saw the way he left a copy of The North Star, Frederick Douglass's abolitionist newspaper, hidden in a barrel. It was a sign. One day, while helping him unload, I accidentally hummed a few bars of Follow the Drinking Gourd. He stopped, his eyes locking with mine. He said nothing, but the next week he pressed a small folded paper into my hand. On it was a crude drawing of a barn with a 5-pointed star painted on the door. It was the first station. The preparations were a constant nerve-wracking secret. Every action had to have a plausible explanation. I began to dry strips of salted meat, telling the cook it was to ward off spoilage. I stitched a small, durable pouch out of canvas, claiming it was to carry my herbs. Inside, I slowly built my escape kit, the dried meat, a small tin of my mother's hidden coins, more for her memory than for their value, a sharp piece of flint for fire and poultices for wounds. Samuel, in his smithy, crafted a small, sturdy knife from a broken file, its handle wrapped in leather. He gave it to me without a word, a silent oath. The most difficult part was studying the patterns of our captors. I became an expert in the habits of the overseer, a cruel man named Finch. I knew he was drunk by 9 every Saturday night. I knew the 2 patrollers who guarded the North Road were more interested in their flask of whiskey than their duties. I learned the baying of the different hounds, which ones were trackers and which were just noise. This knowledge was my shield, a true story of resistance, written in the routines of my enemies. But with every step closer to escape, a single agonizing question grew louder in my heart. Could I leave my father? He was older now, his great strength beginning to wane. The slow, subtle resistance had taken its toll. My mother was gone, taken by a fever years ago, and I was all he had left. The thought of leaving him to face the master's wrath alone was a physical pain. One night, as we sat outside the cabin, I finally asked him. I whispered my plan, the map, the Quaker contact. He listened, his gaze fixed on the North Star he had taught me to trust. When I finished, tears streaming down my face, he placed his heavy hand on my shoulder. "A cage is a cage, Sarah," he said, his voice raspy. "Some of us are too old to fly, but that don't mean the young ones shouldn't. Your mother, she always said a mother buys her own freedom, and her child's. She started collecting those coins for you. The freedom she wanted for you wasn't something to be bought with money. It's something you have to take. You go. You live enough for the both of us. You be my freedom." His blessing was both a gift and a burden. I was no longer just escaping for myself. I was escaping for him, for my mother, for Thomas, for everyone who couldn't. There is a saying, the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. For the enslaved, a plan is not a blueprint. It is a prayer whispered into a storm. Our first attempt was set for a moonless night in late autumn. The air was crisp, the ground hard. Samuel and I, along with a young woman named Esther whose husband had been sold south, were ready. We had the supplies, the map in my head was clear, the signal was set. Everything was perfect, too perfect. As we crept through the woods towards the river, the sky, which had been a blanket of impenetrable black, tore open. A fierce, unseasonable thunderstorm erupted, turning the dry ground to thick, grasping mud. The wind howled like a banshee, and lightning illuminated the landscape in terrifying, brilliant flashes. The creek we planned to follow to the river became a raging torrent. We were soaked, freezing and disoriented. To continue would be suicide. Defeated, we crept back to the quarters, erasing our muddy tracks as best we could, our hearts heavy with failure. We were not caught, but a part of our hope had washed away in that storm. The consequences of our non-escape were subtle at first, then sharp. Master Covington had not noticed our absence, but Overseer Finch, whose senses were as keen as a hound's, felt a change in the air. He saw the shared, disappointed glances. He felt the tension. The plantation rules, already suffocating, became ironclad. No one was allowed out of the quarters after dark for any reason. Extra patrollers were hired. The whippings became more frequent for smaller and smaller infractions. Finch seemed to look for any excuse, his eyes often landing on Samuel, on me. He knew something was brewing, he just couldn't prove it. The punishment, when it came, was not for the escape attempt, but for something else entirely. Finch accused Samuel of stealing a hammer from the smithy, a hammer Finch himself had misplaced. He had Samuel tied to the whipping post. I was forced to watch. I will not describe the sounds or the sight. It is not for entertainment. It is a wound on my memory. What I will tell you is what I saw in Samuel's eyes. As the lash fell, he looked at me, and in his eyes there was no defeat. There was a promise. There was fire. This was their system of control, to break your body, to break your spirit. But as I watched, my terror slowly turned to a cold, hard rage. They could scar our backs, but they could not own our souls. My herbal skills were what saved him. That night, I snuck to his cabin. I cleaned his wounds with a poultice of crushed yarrow to stop the bleeding and plantain leaf to ward off infection. I gave him a tea of willow bark for the pain and fever. While I worked, we spoke in hushed tones. The failure had not broken us. It had forged us. We needed a new plan. Our second attempt was born of that pain and renewed determination. We decided to go in a smaller group, just Samuel and me. The risk was too great for Esther, who had a small child. The new plan was bolder. We would not wait for the cover of a storm, but use the chaos of the harvest festival. The master would have guests, and there would be music and drinking. The watch would be lax. My role was to use my knowledge to create a diversion, a fast-acting stomach ailment for the overseer and his most loyal men, delivered via a special batch of cider. It felt like a gamble with the devil himself. This was my true story of resistance, evolving from quiet defiance to active sabotage. My mother had dreamed that a mother buys her own freedom. I was learning that freedom's price was steeper than any amount of hidden coins. It demanded a willingness to fight back with the enemy's own weapons, deception and cunning. As I brewed that cider, I was no longer just a healer. I was becoming a warrior. The harvest festival approached like a slow-motion storm, pregnant with both celebration and dread. For the master and his family, it was a time of feasting and showing off their wealth. For us, it was a night of precarious opportunity. The final pieces of our plan were falling into place, revealing a network of support I had only dared to dream of. The free wagon driver, Joseph, proved to be our vital link. On his last delivery before the festival, he confirmed our route. The barn with the star was the first stop. From there, a Quaker conductor would guide us to a safe house in Wilmington, a city teeming with abolitionist sympathizers, both black and white. For the first time, the Underground Railroad felt real, a tangible thing, a lifeline thrown into our sea of despair. He also brought a message from the city. Tubman has passed through. The way is clear but watched. Be like the fox. Harriet Tubman. Her name was a legend, a myth, a prayer. Knowing she walked the same paths we were about to take gave me a strength that felt ancient and powerful. But where there is alliance, the shadow of betrayal is never far behind. There was a man named Jasper. He was a house servant, privileged in the small, cruel hierarchy of the plantation. He wore the master's old coats and was given better food. In return, he was the master's eyes and ears. Old Ilara had warned me about him. "His soul is owned," she'd said. I had been careful, never speaking of the plan in his presence. But Jasper was clever. He saw the stolen glances between me and Samuel. He saw the pouch I always carried. He saw hope in our eyes, and he saw it as a threat to his own fragile position. The test of our trust came 2 days before the festival. Finch, the overseer, cornered me by the smokehouse. His eyes were narrow, glittering with suspicion. "Jasper tells me you and the blacksmith are getting restless," he drawled, his voice a low threat. "Tells me you've been looking north. What you reckon you'd find up there, girl? Nothing but cold and starvation." My blood ran cold. Jasper hadn't known the plan, but he had given them the smoke, and now Finch was looking for the fire. I kept my face a mask of placid confusion. "North, sir. I don't know nothing about that. Just doing my work. Samuel, he's just healing from his correction." I held his gaze, praying he couldn't see the frantic beating of my heart. He stared at me for a long moment, then spat on the ground. "See that you do. I'll be watching." The betrayal was a poisoned dart, but it did not kill the plan. It made it more urgent. We had to go now. That night I met with Samuel and old Ilara. The fear was thick in our small cabin. Should we call it off? Was it a trap? It was Ilara, her face a roadmap of weary wisdom, who settled it. "The snake is out of the grass," she whispered. "He struck, but he missed. He won't be expecting you to move now. He thinks he's scared you still. Go now, while he's blind with his own cleverness." The final 24 hours were a blur of painful goodbyes. The hardest was with my father. I didn't need to tell him the plan had accelerated. He knew. He saw it in my eyes. We didn't have a final night of talk under the stars. Our farewell was a shared meal of cornbread and water, a silence so profound it was louder than any words. As I was about to leave, he pressed the last and largest of my mother's hidden coins into my hand. It was a worn Spanish silver dollar. "Your mother wanted this to buy your freedom," he said, his voice thick. "She was right and she was wrong. This coin can't buy it, but your courage can. This is just a reminder of the dream. This is a true story of resistance. Her resistance, now yours." His words were an absolution and a command. The idea that a mother buys her own freedom was now fully transformed. The coin was not payment. It was a symbol of a debt I owed to the past and a promise I was making to the future. I tucked it deep into my pouch. It was time to go. The night of the harvest festival descended. From the quarters, we could hear the distant sounds of a fiddle and laughter from the big house, a world away. The air was cool, smelling of wood smoke and roasting pig. For us, it was the smell of opportunity. My specially doctored cider had been delivered to the overseer's table by a trusted house servant. Now, all we could do was wait. Around 10 o'clock, the signal came. A high, keening song from old Ilara, disguised as a lament. It meant Finch and his men were unwell. It was time. Samuel and I slipped out of our cabins and melted into the shadows. The familiar plantation grounds were transformed into a hostile landscape. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot. Every hoot of an owl was an alarm. We moved silently, following the path I had memorized, a ghost road only I could see. We reached the edge of the woods that bordered the north fields. This was the first point of no return. We took one last look back at the faint lights of the quarters, a silent farewell to the only world we had ever known. Then we plunged into the darkness. The pursuit began sooner than we'd anticipated. Perhaps the cider wasn't as effective, or perhaps Jasper, seeing us gone, had run straight to the master. We had been running for less than an hour when we heard it, the baying of hounds. Not the lazy barks of the usual patrollers, but the deep, eager calls of the master's prized tracking dogs. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me. Samuel grabbed my arm, his grip steady. "Don't you stop, Sarah, don't you dare." This was the moment all my secret study was for. "The creek!" I gasped. "This way!" I veered off the path, leading us through a thicket of thorns that tore at our clothes and skin, towards the sound of running water. We plunged into the frigid creek, the shock of the cold taking our breath away. We waded upstream for a half-mile, the water masking our scent from the dogs. Their baying grew confused, then more distant. We had bought ourselves time. My knowledge of the land became our weapon. I led us through a foul-smelling marsh. I knew the horses would not enter. We smeared the mud on our bodies to further confuse the dogs. I crushed handfuls of sassafras leaves. Their pungent scent another layer of deception. This was no longer just running. It was a chess game against a relentless, unseen opponent. Every step was a move, a calculation. We were nearing the edge of the master's property when we almost ran directly into a patroller on horseback. We dove into a ditch, pressing ourselves into the damp earth, hardly daring to breathe. The horseman stopped just yards away, listening. I could hear the creak of his saddle, the jingle of his harness. Time seemed to stop. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. He was so close I could smell the whiskey on his breath. After what felt like an eternity, he grunted, spurred his horse, and rode on. Help came from the most unexpected of places. As dawn threatened to break, we stumbled, exhausted, into a clearing. A man stepped out from behind a tree, holding a long rifle. He was not white, he was not black. He was native, his face stern and unreadable. We froze, certain we were caught. He looked us over, his eyes lingering on our torn clothes and bleeding scratches. He simply pointed his rifle east. "Marsh gives way to pine in a mile," he said, his voice low. "Follow the pines to the river. White men don't like the swamp." He then vanished back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. He was a ghost, a guardian of the woods, a fellow resistor against a common enemy. The emotional climax was not a moment of triumph, but one of sheer, gut-wrenching terror and relief. After walking for what felt like days, we saw it. Through the trees, a barn, weathered and grey. And on its door, faded but clear, a 5-pointed star painted in white. We had made it. We collapsed against the door, not with a shout of joy, but with silent, shuddering sobs. The dream of a mother buys her own freedom. Felt for the first time not like a distant star, but like the solid wood of this door beneath my hands. This was a true story of resistance, and against all odds, we had just written our most important chapter. My mother's hidden coins were safe in my pouch, but the currency we had spent that night was fear, sweat, and a desperate, unbreakable will to be free. The barn door creaked open, and a man with a plain face and kind eyes, dressed in the simple grey cloth of a Quaker, ushered us inside. "The Lord has guided thee," he whispered, his name Thomas Garrett. We were parcels, freight, and he was our first conductor. The Underground Railroad was now our reality. The journey north was not a single continuous flight, but a series of terrifying leaps of faith between islands of safety. We spent 2 days hidden in Garrett's hayloft, listening to the sounds of his farm, every approaching horse setting our nerves on edge. He brought us food and water, speaking to us of abolition and God's law being higher than man's. Then, one night, he loaded us into a wagon with a false bottom buried beneath sacks of potatoes, and we were moving again. The darkness inside that wagon was absolute. The air was stale, thick with the smell of earth and our own fear. Every bump in the road was a jolt of terror. Was this the moment we would be discovered? At one point, the wagon stopped. We heard voices, a man demanding to know what was in the cargo. My heart stopped. I clutched the Spanish dollar my father had given me, the last of my mother's hidden coins. Its cold metal a small, solid anchor in a sea of fear. I heard Garrett's calm voice. "Just potatoes for the market in Philadelphia, friend. Care for one?" After a tense silence, the wagon lurched forward again. We had passed through another gate of hell. Our next station was in Philadelphia, in the home of William Still, a free black man who was the heart of the city's vigilance committee. His house was a hub of quiet, organized defiance. Here, for the first time, I saw the scope of our movement. I met other fugitives. Their faces, etched with stories as harrowing as my own, still recorded our names, our former masters, and the details of our escape in a large ledger. He was our historian, ensuring we would not be forgotten. He was documenting 1,000 individual acts of bravery, weaving them into one great, true story of resistance. But freedom, I was learning, was a complicated word. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had cast a long, dark shadow even over the so-called free states. Philadelphia was crawling with slave catchers, men who made their living by hunting people like us. We could not walk the streets freely. We were still hiding, still whispering. One afternoon, looking through a curtained window, I saw a poster nailed to a wall. It bore a crude drawing of a man and a woman. "Run away!" the block letters screamed. "From the Covington plantation." A Negro man, Samuel, heavy build. A wench, Sarah, skilled in herbs, 200 reward. Seeing my name on that poster, being reduced to a description and a price, was a violation. Even here, hundreds of miles away, the master's brand was on me. The journey had to continue. Canada was the only place we could be truly safe, beyond the reach of American law. Our next leg of the journey was guided by a woman, a former slave herself, whose name I never learned. She led us by night through the countryside of Pennsylvania, moving from one safe farm to another. It was on this leg that I had my first true experience of freedom. We were resting in a field, waiting for the moon to rise. There were no overseers, no bells, no whips. For the first time in my life, the time was my own. I lay on my back and looked at the stars. I found the drinking gourd, and for the first time, I wasn't looking at it as a map to escape, but as a familiar friend in a new sky. The air felt different. I was breathing free air. The reality of racism in the North was a slow, creeping disappointment. While many were allies, many more looked at us with suspicion or contempt. We were free from the whip, but not from the hatred that had forged the whip in the first place. It was a sobering lesson. My mother's dream that a mother buys her own freedom was not just about breaking chains, but about finding a place in the world. The journey north was not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of a new, more complex one. Our journey ended in St. Catharines, a town in what was then called Canada West. We had crossed the border at night in a small fishing boat. When my feet touched the Canadian soil, a wave of emotion so powerful it buckled my knees washed over me. I wept. Not from sorrow, but from a release so profound I had no other way to express it. The chains were finally, truly broken. Building a new life was like learning to walk again. Samuel, with his skill as a blacksmith, found work almost immediately. I, with my knowledge of herbs, began a small garden and became a local healer, serving the growing community of fugitives and free blacks. We married not long after, in a small church founded by those who had traveled the same path. It wasn't a grand ceremony, but it was ours. For the first time, our union was sanctified by God and our community, not by the permission of a master. But safety was not enough. The stories of those still in bondage, the memory of my father, the face of every person I'd left behind haunted my dreams. I could not rest while they were not free. I found my purpose in the abolitionist movement. My literacy, once a dangerous secret, became my most powerful tool. I began to tell my story. At first it was in small church meetings, then to larger groups. I spoke of the casual cruelty, the separated families, and the unquenchable thirst for freedom. I spoke of my mother and her hidden coins, not as a failed plan to buy freedom, but as a symbol of the defiant hope that slavery could never extinguish. My testimony, and the testimony of others like me, became a weapon against the lies the South told about the happy slave. This was my continuation of the true story of resistance. I became a conductor. I could not go south myself. My face was on too many posters, but from St. Catherine's I helped new arrivals. I used my savings to help them find housing, to buy food and warm clothes. I used my knowledge of the routes to advise the conductors who were still active. I would meet the new fugitives as they arrived, often dazed and terrified, and I would tell them, "You are safe now. You are free." In helping them, I was honoring my father's command to live enough for all of them. Years passed. We built a life, a home. We had 2 children, born free. I taught them to read and write, to know their history, and to be proud of the journey that brought them into the world. One evening, as I was tucking my daughter into bed, she asked me about my mother, Ruth. I took out the old, worn Spanish silver dollar I had carried all that way. I told her the story of a grandmother she never met, who dreamed a beautiful, impossible dream, a dream that a mother buys her own freedom, and the freedom of her children. I held the coin in my palm. It had not bought my freedom. My mother had not bought her freedom. But her dream, her act of saving those small, worthless tokens, had planted a seed in me. It was a seed of defiance, of worth, of a future she could not see. Her legacy was not the coin, it was the story. It was the unshakable belief that we were worth more than the price they put on us. My story is just one of thousands. It is a story of resistance, of resilience, and of the enduring power of the human spirit to seek the light, no matter how profound the darkness. It is a testament to the fact that even when history is written by the victors, the truth survives in whispers, in songs, and in the memories passed down from one generation to the next. What are the stories of resistance in your family? What tales of survival and courage have been passed down to you? Share them, speak them, for in these stories our ancestors live, and their fight for freedom continues.